Dear parents and guardians, dear Salesian educators, and dear Bosconians, good morning. This is a special note for our dear Bosconians graduating from senior high school. I wish to take some of my thoughts from something I have written about 18 years ago when I was a newly ordained priest. I have shared this online in one of my Good Morning talks last week. This I have intended for our young Salesians in the post-novitiate at that time. However, I see that in a certain way, this is applicable to you, my dear graduating batch. Many years ago, in the 70s, 80s, and the first part of the 90s, Don Bosco Canlubang, which was then known as Don Bosco College Seminary, or even earlier, Don Bosco Seminary College, was one huge community of about 150 Salesians, novices, postulants, and seminarians. There was also a group of young men who were taking the technical vocational course in what was then called the Don Bosco Manpower Training Center, which eventually became the Tibet Center. The seminary was self-sufficient in many ways. It had its own farm with a piggery, cattle, poultry, plots of land where corn and vegetables were grown. We processed meat and served fresh milk at table every morning. And we had a bakery. When I came to Canlubang as a seminarian in 1989, there were instances that I was assigned for the afternoon work to help out with the baking of bread. It was a new experience for me. One ingredient was a wonder to me, the yeast, or the leaven. There were several characteristics of this ingredient that I found very interesting. One, the yeast was alive. It was the only ingredient that had life at the time of preparing the bread. Two, the yeast affected the whole mass. It provided growth. Three, the yeast did not have any taste, but it made the bread better. It made it soft and fluffy, so pleasing to the tongue, to the mouth. It was unassuming, seemingly insignificant, but important. Four, at its quote-unquote death, the yeast made the greatest significance. When put into the oven, it gave its final salvo, making the bread rise to its final size. 5. The quantity of yeast that we put is very little, perhaps the least of all the ingredients, but it is responsible for the quantity that is the size of the bread. My dear Bosconians, you are yeast and leaven to the whole world, to the places where you will be. As yeast, you are alive, creative, full of initiatives, self-perfective, always in the disposition of wonder, continuously learning. As yeast, you affect the whole batch of dough. Bosconians are able to influence their peers for the good. As yeast, you are unassuming, but make the difference, whether in studies, sports, music, the arts, technical stuff. As yeast, you experience quote-unquote death. You who sacrifice your time and talent for your fellow Bosconians, like yeast, that is not much, you may not be many, but especially when you go to other places, you are able to reach out to many. See this. The leaven is insignificant and small, but it has power. It is weak, but strong. There is strength even in weakness. And that is your motto, something that you have taken also from years ago when you were in grade school, when you graduated from grade 6. And this is a very good thing, that continuity of this aspect in your life. I wish to bring to you a reflection that I wrote for Sabbath, this publication of the feast books, and I put it on the May 11 day. It was assigned to me, and this was my reflection for that day. I have shared this with you in the Good Morning Talk on May 11, but let me once more refresh you with it. About Ludwig van Beethoven, among the world's greatest composers. It is enough to listen to the final movement of his Ninth Symphony, even just the choral part, the Ode to Joy, and to realize that this was composed by a deaf man, for one to affirm the greatness of Beethoven. At the age of 31, Beethoven realized that he was gradually losing his hearing. And that's the worst thing that can ever happen to a musician. This affected him so much that it also affected his compositions. Here we would think that things would take a turn for the worse, that this disability would end his career. It was far from this. The pain of realizing that he would be deaf injected a heavy dose of feelings into his compositions. From the simplicity of the classical period, music moved into the surge of emotion that characterizes the Romantic period. This is a significant feat of Beethoven, that he belonged to these two periods in music, nay more, that he broke free from one and brought music into another period, one that made authors place an epithet alongside Beethoven's name, the man who changed everything. And all this because of his deafness. From an evil, a defective nature sprang forth a good, both for the individual and for the rest of humanity. In the face of difficulty, sorrow, pain, and even paralysis, take courage. After all, Beethoven changed everything because of his deafness, because of his weakness. Great things spring out of crisis. What great thing would spring from this COVID pandemic crisis? You know, it's the same thing. The Word of God spread because of persecution. Dear Bosconians, Senior High School Batch 2020, be the leaven of the world. You are bound for greatness. Congratulations.